Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel. Today we're going to talk about tests. What is making tests good when they're useful? And to be more precise, we're talking about automated tests. This is where our expertise lies, and because we're developers focusing on the developer tests. So Bart, what does a good test make for you?
For me, one of the most important tasks of a test is to be expressive about expectations of code. So when I look at a test, I want to easily see what the case is. So something like given, when, then often really helps there. But also, I want to clearly see in the test what's the input state and what's the output state that I'm asserting, and what is the operation that I'm testing. There's basically three aspects to every test, and that's input, operation, output. I want to clearly see those three, and I want to clearly see what exactly the output is. I think that's high over what for me makes a test good.
Okay, so I think I can rephrase this by saying that a test should be sufficient and focused, in a sense that sufficient, you have all the information that is important for the test specified in the test. The counterexample for this, if you have some fixtures, some pieces of information that are in external files, in external helpers that are not exposed to your test, and you just rely on your implicit knowledge that things are done in the way that the test wants. And focused means that you don't have too much noise in your test. You don't want to have details that are not essential for the test popping up in the test, so that you can clearly see what it is focusing, not or about what it's necessary to achieve the goal of this particular test.
And so what's it for you?
In my list of things, that was on my first step. So that's why I use this opportunity just to rephrase what you said in my words. And I hope it's
nice.
I think it's more or less similar. But another part for me, it's, and this is maybe where we can slightly drift from each other, is for me, I want a test to cover a sensible chunk of logic. I don't want a test to cover a small piece and then I need to look for another test that covers another small test and use my mind to compose the end result out of it. Okay, it's not universal. Sometimes it's good to have smaller tests. But what I'm saying maybe also here, a good test, a better test for me is the one that relies less on my knowledge of the rest of the system and how the pieces are working together, and also on the test that makes less assumptions if possible. And in this way, maybe a little bit clumsy, I am coming to the point that less good test for me is the one that relies a lot on mocks or a lot on implicit expectations of how other pieces of the system behave. And that maybe also correlates a little bit on the previous step about sufficient, test being sufficient, not necessarily only in the way how the test context is set up, but also how the test is performed, how the system under the test is taken out. Does it make any sense?
No, I think it makes sense, and I think what you're also touching on here is the connection between test quality and system quality. I think a badly designed system will generate badly designed tests, if that makes any sense.
I would not necessarily say, and that's where we have the difference of views since the episode on integration unit test.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that depends all on the type of the test. So here we might be slightly deviating and saying, okay, tests that are less good for us in these definitions. Those tests on the lower level, on the unit testing level, might be indicative of not the best, for testing at least, design of the system that we're testing.
So are you saying a good test is independent of system design?
On the high level, you can have a good or a bad test independently on the system design. Well, it's never fully independent, but you have much more independence, much less dependence. On the low level, when you're writing unit tests, it becomes more difficult to write a good unit test without some refactoring for testability, in my experience.
Yeah, but isn't that just a system test with a smaller system?
Yes, maybe. It's a smaller system, but the scale does make difference. If your small system doesn't involve this, in smaller systems, you can avoid thinking about concerns that bigger systems have, because in smaller systems, and we're speaking about pieces of our system, honestly, you don't have to worry about consistency, talking to databases, maybe even error handling, because that will be handled somewhere else in your bigger system. Whereas bigger systems have to, at some point, start worrying about those things, because at some point they're starting to cross the boundaries. Yes, you can have much bigger unit test or isolated test. And that's also a topic of discussion, what you call unit test, what is not unit test. For me, it's perfectly fine also to have a unit test that tests a little bit bigger chunk than a small method and something. And then you don't, again, maybe not necessarily have to refactor to have a relatively good unit test. But it depends. I think there is a correlation, but it's not strong, and it's not always true. I've seen relatively good systems very badly tested.
Yes.
And I've seen bad systems relatively okay tested on the higher levels. What I maybe agree with you that I rarely see bad systems, well, that's subjective in my opinion, bad systems well tested on unit tests, that I don't see much. Here you might be right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yay! Now, so I have a different question for you. You said earlier you want tests to test real chunks of logic. So the question I have there is, like, the concept of fail fast encourages software engineers to guard against programmer error by throwing exceptions from low-level classes if the input contract of that particular method is violated. So if you have such a safeguard in your code at a low level, I would expect a low-level unit test that validates that error being thrown there is actually a conscious decision. But then you are creating a test that is so low level that it's not necessarily bound to a user journey, essentially, but it is bound to a programmer journey.
And I think it's a very good example, because it indeed shows a kind of a test that I might treat as pointless. Like, you have somewhere a not null exception or some assertion about the state,
right,
which is when you go into the code in that particular small piece, it's very obvious that yes, if you pass me null, then I am throwing an exception. What here to test?
Yes. So you would think a unit test pointless there?
I would think unit test to be pointless, but I agree that you can use unit test, and I think it's a matter of the style already. You can use a unit test to highlight that you are doing this on purpose, and that's not that you're overly defensive, but there are reasons for that. Although you could have done the same with a comment or with a message that you're throwing, and that's how I would usually do. I would put all the details why I am doing this check into the exception, because if it does happen, I don't want people to go look for tests or look for code. They ideally they will just see exception and they will be explicitly said, okay, I never expected this happened. This is because probably you need to check this and this.
Yeah, so you're saying that if the exception being thrown already indicates that this is a conscious decision, then having a unit test on that exception being thrown is pointless.
It does not necessarily add much value because, again, stylistic. If you have this agreement that we don't do comments, but we use our unit test to document our code, then yes, you might want to have this extra test. But on the other hand, I can also give you lots of examples, especially in the legacy code bases from different people with different convention. You can have lots of tests that are doing those checks just because they were adding a null pointer exception or something else, and it's not necessarily means that it was very, very cautious decision. Sometimes it was, sometimes it no. So it does not. It's the same way as if someone is putting comment or just not doing anything. There is a check. There is an assertion. Then someone thought that it would be a good idea. Maybe it was a good idea. Hopefully they explained it in some way. If the only way they knew is unit test, it's probably better than nothing.
Yeah, it's just there's an added benefit there, that there's also like the regression defense. Like if someone maybe refactors that method and then does not fail fast, then that unit test will fail, and that will make that person that is doing the refactoring think about, should I actually throw an exception here?
Well, yes, theoretically, yes. Practically, I doubt that it will hold very much strongly, because usually when you're doing very small refactoring, like very isolated, you would easily see that you're removing this null pointer exception. Or assertion, let's say assertion, not null pointer exception. You're removing this assertion. The added benefit of this check that we did assertion, probably not very high. It would be much higher if you have a bigger refactoring, because then you are changing the structure. And then it's very easy indeed to miss some subtle things, especially if you were not the one who were adding them or you lost already that context. And there, this test might have helped, but then we're getting back to the problem that if the test is very low level and testing just immediately that we pass the thing and through exception, then probably it will also be it will be taken away in the same way as the code. So because too many changes will be happening, it will be lost in the ripple of the changes. Yeah, maybe. But I don't.
Yeah.
But I also don't want. Well, on the other hand, for or any of those exceptions to have test assertions. I don't know. I usually add those assertions that I don't expect to really normally happen often, and then I would not be adding really a test for that yes, indeed this is happening, unless there is something really specific I want to test, unless there is something tricky.
Yeah, I would add a test there because of the documenting and regression part, but also because I think that a unit test is extremely cheap.
So it's extremely cheap to run, but it's not that cheap to maintain. Well, okay, I can understand, I can agree in a sense that it's not very expensive to run, it's not very expensive to add, and usually those small unit tests, as the one you are saying, they would not be that hugely difficult to refactor. So maybe you're right, it's not such a huge deal. But
I also get your point that the value is also small, but since the cost is so I guess it's in the end a style thing.
Yeah, well, for me the problem is that if I know that Bart edited or someone doing like this, so I know that they thought about that and added it on purpose. But it's not always the case with the test code base. Sometimes you have a mix. Many things are sensible, but there is also much noise. And in my experience, usually those tests would be in the area of noise. So if there are much tests like that, I would start to disregard them. They will not be adding much more than just the fact that there were exceptions. But okay, I think we digressing a little bit into the details, which is interesting.
I think so too. So this was an interesting digression, and we talked about so what is good structure, what that it should be focused and expressive. But I don't think we've really gotten to the depth of what makes a good test yet. So let's continue next time. Cool.
Awesome.